Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Barry Andrews and myself, who are co-organizing this event, are delighted to welcome you here. I wish a warm welcome to all our guests and our public who are following this meeting, which will be interpreted to English, French, and Arabic. I am a special rapporteur and chair of the Subcommission on Safety and Defense. And we are now celebrating the sad 10th birthday of the revolution in Syria, 10 years during which the international community remained powerless. Worse, even some countries, Russia, Iran, Turkey, have become main actors within this conflict, and they only added suffering to suffering without ever bringing Syria closer to peace nor protecting citizens. Today, we won't tackle all problems in Syria. We would merely repeat what we all know, or even worse, forget to say certain things which must be repeated. Today, we will hear Syrian voices, the most legitimate to represent their countries, and we will focus on the fight against impunity because we are convinced that this is a fertile ground where Europe has started acting and where Europe should be even more active. We are convinced that there won't be any peace without justice. No one should forget the victims of war crimes and crimes against humanity. In their memory, we have the duty, after they dying because of Bashar al-Assad, because of the militias, because of the Russian government, because of al-Nusra, Daesh, and many more, we have the duty to act. Europe has started to act, and I would like to applaud the efforts already deployed in order to identify, go to court, and punish perpetrators of terrorist attacks. Then on Bashar al-Assad's regime, chemical weapons, bombings, torture, killings. Well, 136,000 Syrians are today detained. 15,000 or more have died under torture, and the humanitarian situation is worsening day after day in Syria. Meanwhile, Syrian officials are benefiting from a very nice situation, and this is outrageous, and unfortunately morality is sometimes not enough to make the international community move, especially when Russia uses its right to veto at the UN Security Council. But the interest of the international community and Europe, well, is to see peace flourish in Syria and refugees go back to Syria. But we should be honest, a retort to Syria is impossible without justice, and Europe must take position when facing the impunity of Bashar al-Assad and his government. In Germany, for the very first time, in Koblenz, an official from Assad's government has been condemned, and in France, two more actions have been undertaken, and after the attacks which led to thousands of victims. All of this has been made possible thanks to the actions of Syrian activists and the justice of certain countries which decided to move, but I am convinced that we can do more, and I do expect our guests to share their expectations now. Let me now give the floor to my colleague, Barry Andrews. Thank you.
For those opening remarks. It is a great pleasure to be co-hosting with you on this topic that is very close to my heart. I was the CEO of an Irish NGO called Goal, and Goal to this day continues to program aid into northwest Syria, into Idlib province. And this involvement on my part sparked a great interest in the plight of the Syrian people, which continues to this day. So I'm delighted to be able to be here for this. But as Nathalie says, we are 12 days away from a tragic anniversary, 10 years since the uprising began. And it is a harsh reminder of the ongoing suffering and injustice being experienced by the people of Syria. But we should also see it as an important call to action to renew our efforts to combat these injustices and put an end to the conflict. This is a conflict that is in danger of being a forgotten crisis. It is in danger of being a neglected crisis, and we must do all that we can to keep our focus on the plight of the Syrian people. As Nathalie says, the focus of our webinar today is the fight against impunity, whether it be the use of chemical weapons, the use of barrel bombs against civilian infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, and the imposition of sieges, which is somewhat forgotten about. Thousands have been detained and tortured, and these constitute clear breaches of international humanitarian law and in some cases amount to war crimes. And yet perpetrators have not been brought to justice, and they have not been held accountable, and this can't be tolerated. But there will be no peace without accountability. It is a critical prerequisite of having peace in Syria. Fight against impunity will remain central for our efforts to build a sustainable and lasting peace. As Nathalie said, the Koblenz verdict delivered in Germany last week under the principle of universal jurisdiction was a first ruling against a member of the Syrian regime. It's an important first step, and we'll hear more about it during the discussion. We hope that today's discussions will provide further insights into what the European Union can do to help the fight against impunity. I'm therefore delighted to welcome three authoritative Syrian voices to today's debate. And before I introduce them, I just want to make a few housekeeping announcements to the speakers and to everybody listening. First of all, we have allotted 10 minutes to each of the speakers, and we consider that to be a maximum, not a target. So I will notify you when you are in the red zone after 9 minutes. Secondly, just to remind the speakers to speak on the channel according with the language that they're going to use, English, French, or Arabic, and also to encourage everybody listening to use the hashtag Syria10 and to get involved in the debate. So I'm delighted to welcome our first contributor this evening, Anwar Al Bunni, who's a human rights lawyer and head of the Syrian Center for Legal Studies and Research. He was first banned from practicing by Syrian courts in 2002 after he defended political activists due to their calls for democratic reforms. He was later imprisoned for his work. Mr. Al Bunni fled to Germany in 2012 and has been actively involved in the Koblenz trial. So Anwar, over to you for your contribution. Thank you. Do we have Anwar? Yes.
تحياتي.
My greetings. Thank you. Thank you very much for the Renew Europe. I would like also to thank Mr. Andrews and Mrs. Loiseau, Nathalie, and Shams Al-Ghanaimi for inviting me and for the organization of this meeting. I thank you very much. From the outset, I would like to say that this 10th anniversary of the start of the Syrian revolution, it has been an uprising of Syrian citizens who have claimed freedom and dignity, but they have been confronted with the harshest types of violence. Many personalities, many politicians are talking about a civil war in Syria. In fact, the situation in Syria is in the form of war against people, against society, and not a civil society between the different components of one society. I understand very clearly the different commentators who talk about the situation in Syria, saying, for example, that this is a war against extremist organizations. I would like to say that until the second year of the war in Syria it has been a war against citizens, against people who were peacefully demonstrating, and the Syrian regime and other countries were supporting some factions who were holding extremist slogans in order to disfigure the revolution of Syria and to disfigure the Syrian people who were claiming their rights. We believe that the European Union, whom we consider as the upholder of the principles of human rights worldwide, and is the reference in this sense, but it has limited capacities in terms of stopping this slaughter which is taking place against the Syrian people. Well, until today, all the capacity of the European Union have not yet been used at a full-fledged level, because maybe there is not that political will in order to use all the capacity of the European Union in order to solve the situation in Syria. I am not here meaning the military intervention, but I mean that they still have some pressure means and ways, especially the accountability aspect as an example. And this is one of the most important tools to exert some pressure on the situation in Syria. Though the European Union have withdrawn its ambassadors early, but even after the elections of 2014, and this and everybody knows that these elections were not transparent and did not reflect the will of the Syrian people, and the European Union did not withdraw their recognition of those who is representing officially Syria. And I think and I hope that they will not lose the opportunity again, because these criminals are trying to rehabilitate themselves before civil society. We hope that Europe will not let go this opportunity of not acknowledging or recognizing any election that would take place, because Syria is there with no one who can represent Syria, and they should actively send away anyone who thinks that they represent the Syrian regime. And this is something that is in the hand of some states that believe in democracy. Well, there are some proposals that these are some proposals that the European Parliament could use. Secondly, we have the decisions of Koblenz and the files which were presented in Germany and in Sweden and in Austria, and this has actually covered 60 criminals, including Bashar al-Assad, and we had some search warrant and some arrest warrant against Jamil Hassan, Ali Mamlouk, and Mahmoud, and there are some other arrest warrants that were not declared. These are the warrants which were declared, and Bashar al-Assad is concerned about these crimes, not because he is the head of a state, but because he has perpetrated these crimes personally when he signed the capital punishment against the 14 people. And this was outside the law. And this is incriminating because he signed these these decisions. And this is a crime which was perpetrated by a person, as a person, not because he is a head of a state, but personally. And I hope that the decision would be clear and final so that we can never ever consider that there are some representatives of Syria anywhere in the world, were it in international conferences or meetings and so forth, or before any state or any government. Secondly, what is happening in Germany, especially the decision which was issued last week, which the name of Bashar al-Assad was mentioned 5 times, and it has condemned the structure in Syria, and which was set in order to exterminate the Syrian people, and it was the Syrian regime which was accused, and this has targeted one of the security people in Syria as part and parcel of this scheme and not as a criminal. After this decision and after the arrest warrant at the international level, which was issued, now there is a legal hindrance and impediment against these people. And therefore, we can no longer deal with them or consider them as part and parcel of a political solution. And I also believe that the political solutions could be considered for rebuilding peace. But in reality, what is clear in front of everybody and in different courts is that this regime cannot be part and parcel of a political solution. And until now, and after 10 years, everybody knows that this regime has never been part of any negotiation and has never given any positive sign in order to release any detainee. We have many people who are still missing, and I think that the figures that we have taken from different sources, 70,000 and more were killed under torture. We understand that there are some economic interests, the economic interest of Europe and the interest in order to build peace, but the fact of allowing these people not to be punished, to have them under impunity, is a sort of a green light that is given to many dictators worldwide, or those who are aspiring to be dictators, as if you were telling them you can kill whom you want in your people, you can perpetrate any crimes inside your country, and we are ready to pardon you, and we can deal with you if you win in the field. And this is a sort of threat to hundreds and millions of people in the Middle East and in Latin America and in other places, with all the threat that this has against different citizens. The main concern of Europeans and apprehension of Europeans is terrorism, especially Daesh and ISIS and Nusra. And this is our own concern too. Before you in Europe, these are organizations that killed more Syrians than threatened Europeans. These organizations are the enemies of the Syrian people from the very first day they existed. And therefore, the fact of combating these systems cannot be done by supporting other terrorist organizations. And therefore, this means that we are encouraging them to get some wins from what they are doing. And therefore, we have many people who have contributed to creating these terrorist organisms, and therefore they will be awarded for that, especially Bashar and others. And this will be a risk for everybody worldwide. I would like to conclude by saying that we are all hopes towards the European Union, and we say that we are, as a Syrian entity, we are ready to cooperate, and we need a sort of centers for tracing these people, to prosecute them, and to follow them up, especially those who arrived and landed in Europe, in order to give a guarantee of a peaceful future in Syria, and also to prosecute these people who have reached Europe and found in Europe a sort of heaven that would receive them even temporarily. As Syrians, we have the expertise and we can cooperate with the judiciary instances in Europe to help in this sense. And this is our duty, and this is a necessity for the peace and security of our countries and your countries.
Thank you, Anwar. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for keeping to your time, and really appreciate your opening comments for this webinar. So let's go straight away then to our second contributor this evening, who is Dr. Bassma Kodmani. Dr. Kodmani is a Syrian scholar and university professor in France, and a former spokesperson for the Syrian National Council. Dr. Kodmani is currently a member of the negotiating team for the UN-led peace talks in Syria and a member of the Syrian Constitutional Committee established by Security Council Resolution 2254. She's also a co-founder of Global Syria, an initiative launched by the Syrian diaspora to connect and leverage its skills for the reconstruction of Syria. So, Dr. Kodmani, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à Nathalie Loiseau, à Barry Andrews, à l'équipe. Et je souhaite vous dire combien.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barry Andrews and Nathalie Loiseau. I want to say how important this initiative is for us Syrians, because it gives sense to the Syrian tragedy. Syrians today, and for many years now, have been facing total indifference vis-à-vis their sufferings and the crimes committed in Syria. And this indifference is disturbing and leads to a lack of sense. And when there is such a strong echo of a trial from a court in a democratic country to say that this person committed a crime and will be sanctioned, well, then we have some hope. And this gives back sense and meaning to us. So I want to say that speaking of all of this is very important to us, and I'd have 5 points, 5 messages, since time is limited. First of all, I'd like to say that this process and the trial of criminals is a process which is pacific. It's actually the most pacific process, and it is founded on law. Such an approach based on law can lead to some justice, and then can also lead to creating the basis of a society based on law. Our society, Syrian society, has lived in an arbitrary regime without law, and we've been deprived of law. Today, thanks to this trial, which is a first example, we are able to talk about what a sanction, a fair sanction is. A fair sanction for these people who committed crimes. What criteria should we have in mind, and what are the levels of responsibilities of one and another? A debate on this is needed and has been nuanced here. And within the opposition, there is a debate on this. And I think that transitional justice allowed to make a leap forward within society. Amongst the different questions we need to tackle, and this will be my second point, it is essential for half of Syrian society to take into account violences against women and to take into account violences against women in all its shapes and shades, because these crimes are killing women socially as well. They are destroyed psychologically, and we need to know that crimes against women, violences against women in detention centers also lead to killings and murders of women, because it is not possible for families to bear such a dishonor. And this also leads to many families migrating and moving out of Syria. Many families moved out of Syria because they feared violences against women, against young girls, against spouses, sisters, and this is something which has to be taken into account. Crimes against women are a fight to wage, a battle to wage. Within this battle for justice, many women have come to us, and only very few dare to take the floor. It is dramatic, and for us it is important to have a better understanding of all of this, including for the criminal courts. Third point I'd like to tackle. We need to have a major debate on what it means to stop following laws and orders from the Syrian regime, and what it means to confess, because we've been following this for quite some time because of one good reason. Some, if they confess, may have lighter fines or sentences, and furthermore, it is a message to all of those who would like to defect. And it is important to say that that justice won't be sacrificed, and that there will be means also for people who decide to defect. I know that for legal experts, for the prosecutor, for court, debates are intense, and I know that progress on this issue is happening right now. We are talking with judges, and we know that they are asking themselves several questions, and we hope that the Syrian case will help have a better understanding and reading of such situations, because it is important for several people to be able to defect, to leave Assad, and to understand well that it is not possible anymore in this world to continue with such a political regime. Fourth point, justice, which is applied today to criminals. This justice is happening at the margin of any political action, and actually the political process is stopped, suspended, if I may say, frozen, even though, well, the Constitutional Committee in Geneva didn't make any progress. It looks like we are blocked politically, and there are very few hopes regarding Damas, which would be ready to start some negotiations and making some concessions which would lead to a political process.
D'autant plus bruyante.
And here we would need the European Union to make its voice heard so that the political process could move on, that it makes its voice heard on impunity. We need justice today, and the fight against impunity is sending strong messages to the highest responsible and those supporting them, responsible of those atrocities. This is not contradictory with the previous point. The highest officials will not defect. We need to know that those supporting them think that the solution could emanate from a promise of general amnesty. We have seen that in other countries, and we have seen it backfiring. It is not a realistic solution for Syria. It is a recipe for disaster, for prolonged violence. And that request has been renewed again and again by countries supporting the regime. It is of the utmost importance to say that the political process is important, but rehabilitating the highest responsible, especially the head of state, is non-negotiable, either today, in 5 years, or in 10 years. Those people will have to face the full force of justice. And it is important to say that, to say, how could we rehabilitate them? How would that even be imaginable? We need to embrace Moscow, Tehran, so that we prevent them to imagine that rehabilitation is possible, to prevent them from hoping that rehabilitation is possible. Hence, we need a very strong signal from the European Union. Finally, we are also expecting mobilization from European countries, from democratic countries, beyond the issue of impunity. Today, countries thinking that they can find a solution for Syria are countries who do not believe in justice, who do not apply the rule of law at home, and would rather the amnesty of the big criminals, those big criminals. In Syria, we need to rebuild our society, and especially our judiciary system. That system collapsed. It is completely biased. And Europe is probably our only and biggest hope in the support for rebuilding a true Syrian justice. It existed back in the days. We do not start from scratch. Before the Assad regime, Syrians had a real justice, a genuine justice system. This is what we need to give back to Syrians. Maybe even before talking about elections, we need to make sure that Syrians have justice with non-corrupted judges, with fair people representing the law and giving back trust in law. I will stop here so that I do not take more time, and I thank you for your attention.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Kodmani. It's very clear. Your points are very well made, and we're just delighted to be here this evening to provide that hope that if the EU is indeed the only and best hope, we're delighted to be here to discuss this. So let me go to our final panelist this evening, who is Remy Jarrah, a Syrian journalist who covered the uprising in 2011 under the pseudonym Alexander Page SY. He was later awarded the International Press Freedom Award for this work. Mr. Jarrah founded the Activists News Association to coordinate a Syrian-wide network of citizen journalists after fleeing to Egypt and later Turkey. He has played a key role in documenting the crimes committed in Syria and raising the profile of the Syrian conflict on the international stage. So Remy, I will give you the floor for your contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you to MEPs, Nathalie, Loiseau, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and MEP Barry Andrews for their efforts in organizing this event. And also thank you to my fellow panelists as well, who were here speaking. And of course to Shamsul Ghunaimi, who invited me and has always been involved in impeccable work when it comes to Syria. I wanted to start by providing, I know we don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to start by providing some context, as I know this may be a little frustrating for those who already have a good idea of why Syria is where it is. But nevertheless, I think context when talking about Syria is always important because of the complications involved. It was 10 years ago that Syrians took to the streets and demanded freedom and democracy. And they were very quickly met with extreme violence, detention, torture, and plain out terrorism by the Assad regime. Iranian militias were deployed to Syrian neighborhoods. The Russian state provided Assad with a political cover. And as months went by, and after an incompetency by the international community to protect Syrian civilians, and after it had become apparent to Syrians that they would have to defend themselves and that no one was really going to intervene, the opposition would begin arming itself. This of course came after months of some of the most horrific human rights abuses that we as a world have collectively seen. Assad's forces would soon use chemical weapons on civilian neighborhoods. Communities would very quickly, the international community very quickly backtracked on red lines that it drew. And delegations that were sent before and after this period were sent to Syria with no progress really being made. Failure after failure meant that Syrians would eventually lose total faith in the international community. And as time went by, fabrications and absurd scenarios that were dictated by the Assad regime would become a reality. Syria would gradually become an actual breathing ground for radical Islam. And as the Assad regime continued to concentrate its attacks on civil society almost exclusively, ISIS would emerge, posing a threat, first and foremost, by the way, to Syrian civil society. And of course, this was of great convenience to Assad. Now, there are those who choose to deny this and prefer to paint a picture of Assad simply fighting this jihadist insurgency. But those same individuals fail to answer very critical questions. For example, in 2011 and the years that followed, why did Assad release thousands of jihadists from Syrian prisons, the vast majority of them, by the way, eventually joining ISIS's ranks? All the while, tens of thousands of Syrians who simply demanded freedom were rotting in Assad's prisons. Why did the Assad regime target almost every single school, bakery, marketplace, field hospital, and yet when it came to targeting ISIS's headquarters in the very center of the city of Raqqa, a complex the size of a football field, by the way, even when electricity was totally cut off from the city, this complex was glowing in the dark, and still the Syrian regime was oblivious to it. The tactic was obvious: label your opponents as terrorists, obliterate them, and allow actual terrorists to flourish, because this serves the narrative. This explains why Assad released jihadists from prison. It explains why all sides of civilian lives were being bombed. And it also explains why Russia's intervention in Syria began in cities such as Aleppo, Idlib, Homs, Hama, Daraa, Damascus, where there were literally no signs of ISIS. The Assad regime, Russia and Iran, and those who speak for them, and it's unfortunate to say this, but there are those who speak for them even in EU chambers, who try to represent the absurdity, want to lead us to believe that the whole world is conspiring with jihadists against Assad. International organizations such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, the Committee to Protect Journalists, just to name a few, all conspiring with jihadists to overthrow the Assad regime. They're also saying that when hospitals or schools are constantly attacked by airstrikes and barrel bombs, and that we see this with our own eyes, we catch all this on tape, that it's a figment of our imagination. That 500,000 Syrians, and the vast majority of them, by the way, having died as a direct result of aerial attacks, that isn't true. Let us not forget that to this day, not a single warplane or helicopter has been lifted off the ground by any member or faction of the opposition. And the Syrian regime and the Russian state are responsible for 94% of the death toll in Syria. Such numbers are significant. When Russia intervened in Syria, I was personally in Aleppo in a dispatch. And as we began to see the Russian jets pounding the city, I found myself trying through my reporting to explain or prove simple logics. ISIS isn't here, we would say. Why are the Syrians and the Russians constantly attacking markets, schools, bakeries, homes? When we all knew why Russia was there and that it was only there to intervene because Syrian civil society was gaining ground and that this had nothing to do with the emergence of ISIS. Russia has stood in the way of any realistic and justifiable solution to the Syrian justice process, and since 2011 has vetoed 14 resolutions at the UN Security Council. Russia even vetoed a resolution which referred all parties in Syria, not just the Assad regime, but all parties in Syria that were committing crimes against any civilians to be referred to the International Criminal Court. And yes, that was vetoed as well. So why does Russia block such attempts for accountability? Let's agree first that Russia does not only have a dog in this fight. Russia itself is responsible for the murder of thousands of civilians in Syria. So of course they will use veto powers to protect their interests. And this is why it is no secret that the UN Security Council has been compromised when it comes to Syria. And so on the subject of impunity, I think that because of all this, Europe has a grave responsibility. First of all, if I could outline these, the EU must prosecute Assad's war criminals. They must be arrested on European soil, just as ISIS members have been arrested and tried in courts across the EU with the same enthusiasm, because they're criminals. Diplomatic ties between the EU and the Assad regime must remain non-existent. The EU should strongly condemn any attempts by any of its member states trying to normalize relations with Assad. There remain, I think this was mentioned, but there remain 130,000 detainees in Syrian prisons, all in Assad's prisons, to be specific. The EU must bolster its demands for their release and ensure that they remain at the top of the agenda. The EU must also demand for the release of imprisoned journalists in Syria. Over 400 to this day remain in Assad's prisons. 550 journalists, by the way, have been murdered by the Assad regime. And when communicating with Russia on Syria, the EU must understand that it is not simply dealing with a mediator, but that Russia is directly culpable for war crimes in Syria. And therefore, any proposals by the Kremlin should be scrutinized when it comes to Syria and dealt with that mindset. EU member states that are involved in any negotiation process must exercise more pressure on the Assad regime. I say more pressure because in Geneva 1, a 6-point plan was of consensus, and it was literally scrapped by the Assad regime. And the international community simply moved on to further negotiations, setting the precedent to the Assad regime and the Russians that they could just use these talks to buy more time. The EU must also ensure that Syrians remain risk-free from deportation. Not only does Europe have a responsibility to ensure this on its own territory, but must also exercise pressure on countries such as Turkey and Lebanon to provide equal reassurances, because today millions of Syrians in these countries live day to day with the threat of deportation, and this is simply unacceptable. Now, we may call it a defense mechanism, but Syrians today have become desensitized, where one refrains from building hope because each and every time hope is being destroyed right in front of their eyes. And it's why I think these points I've mentioned are important. And because accountability for Syrians is important. And without it, building hope or trust for the future is simply not possible, because if it's true, and I say this because these are the things that we see in the news and we see everywhere being relayed, a sort of sentiment. If it's true that the international community is beginning to tickle the idea of Assad remaining in power as some sort of solution, then the international community must face the reality that it has already failed in Syria. And that in the coming years, there will be more instability, more turmoil, more people will leave Syria, more will come to this region and go elsewhere. And on that note, it's simply not easy to be optimistic when speaking about Syria. But one light in a very dark tunnel is that Syrians today are building a global community. And as the Syrian diaspora is unfortunately one of the fastest growing diasporas in current times. But because this mass migration has happened in such a short period of time, it means that Syrian communities remain interconnected. They will integrate in places like Europe and elsewhere and the world and become part of this political landscape. But one thing for certain is that they will collectively continue to make sure that it is everyone's knowledge that Assad is the root cause of all of this, and that any solution that does not involve crippling the very system that he heads and does not bring about genuine justice will most certainly be rejected. Syrians will not backtrack on demands for Assad to go. And an end to the Assad regime is the primary demand and will always be the primary demand. I think I've taken up more time. I'm very sorry. I just want to say I thank those MEPs who do their part to raise the voices of those who are unable to defend themselves. I know that there are those of you who are working hard, and I think I can confidently say on behalf of Syrians that you are most certainly appreciated. Thank you.
Well said, Remy, and thank you very much for your contribution as well. And it's hard to recapture 10 years ago and that sense of optimism and hope before radicalization and fragmentation occurred at this remove. But I think you painted that picture very well. So let's open up the discussion now. We've already had a few questions come in online, and I'll come to those just now. But I just want to go through the obvious best place for accountability is the ICC, but we all know why that's not a realistic prospect. However, there is this other case involving Myanmar where jurisdiction was able to be engaged because of Rohingya Muslims in Bangladesh. And so there's a case now originating in Jordan. I wonder would the panelists like to make a comment about the ICC before we move on to other areas around universal jurisdiction, the Koblenz case, transitional justice. Let's just deal with the ICC. Would anybody in the panel, perhaps Anwar, would you like to make a comment on the ICC generally and that issue that I've just mentioned?
شكرا أندراوس.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. In fact, this is an important signal here. There is a very big gap in the aspect that relates to the jurisdiction of the ICC. We know that sorry, the sound is cutting, bad connection. Well, this will give a sort of exceptional solution once the file would be tabled or transferred to the ICC. 4 times this attempt failed, and this is because of the Chinese and Russian vetoes, and the file of Syria did not reach the ICC. And this veto will continue to be used, unfortunately. Well, you talked about the competence and jurisdiction of the ICC on the basis of the precedents of Myanmar and Bangladesh. This is a light of hope, and we have about 27 survivors have in Jordan. They have actually tabled a file because of that situation. And this is a main legal principle. And I think that there are many problems that the ICC is still trying to rule upon and to solve them. And this is, in fact, in the form of the necessity that Jordan should apply or present complaints and it is Bangladesh which actually filed a complaint before the ICC. And this is the difference between Syria and Bangladesh, considering that Jordan, until today, has never moved in order to file a complaint as a country which has been victim of a prejudice. And Jordan is a member of the ICC. We hope that the ICC would accept that file. And we have actually another competence, which is the international competence. And this is something that will overcome the gap. That is, to have this international and global competence will mean that any country who is keen on having an international peace will fight against this threat to a global peace. And the fact that we have this impunity of this type of criminals is something that is threatening the global peace, because this gives opportunity to these people to further commit crimes and heinous crimes, because there are many cases of impunity of many others, especially Pinochet, who was not prosecuted, even if we had this global and international competence and jurisdiction, and he was somehow tried in Spain. And therefore, if not all the European countries will be able to adopt this system of global competence and jurisdiction, I think at least the European Parliament or the European Union would actually adopt the different measures that relate to this universal and global competence that will give force to these decisions and these prosecutions that would be taken place before the ICC, and this will give much hope to the ICC decision should all the European Union adopt these universal competence decision. And I think that the European Parliament should also take this initiative for this very purpose.
Okay.
And well, the many through the Geneva process did not put an end to injustice, though there was an pressure in this sense, but many criminals gained much time to perpetrate more destruction. And I think the European Union should put an end to all these crimes, despite the process which has been taking place for 8 years. I think that all the process of Geneva should be reviewed in order to put some measures, and this is what we consider as the only solution to the situation.
Thank you, Anwar. And I'll just encourage Remy and Bassma, if you want to jump in, just to use the raise hand function. I won't invite you to speak unless you particularly feel that you would like to add something. But Bassma, I will go to you now. You said very interesting comments about the major debate about following orders and confessions, and I think the idea of choice on the part of defendants, and how this would mitigate the severity of sentences that might be applied. It's an interesting concept. You were very clear that shouldn't apply to the upper echelons of leadership, but could you just expand that, and particularly with reference to the Koblenz case, because the man convicted last week was, do you have some concerns about that?
I do not have concerns. First of all, I have full trust in the
interpreters do not hear the speak.
I beg your pardon, Bassma, if you would just choose the channel that you're going to speak in. If you're speaking in English, the interpreters can pick you up when you're in English.
Pardon. Alors, Barry, je vais parler français.
Oui, c'est plus facile. Merci.
Then I will speak French. Okay. I have no reservation whatsoever on the process that has been followed, and we fully trust the fact that the court in Koblenz is reviewing several cases, and that in the Syrian context, it has a very broad knowledge of that context, and that it is taking into account all those aspects. We all have more or less accurate information on some elements that were used in Syrian prisons. Who would like to find a solution, and who don't know what to expect whatsoever? And let me take the case of Caesar. It is an ideal case because he is a testimony of all of that and responsible of nothing. He is not involved in the crimes, and therefore the question should not apply in his case. But in many cases, and in the cases of Koblenz that was just judged, I think we had the discussion, and the person had to detain people, arbitrarily or not, and lead them in that monstrous prison. In Khatib. What is his degree of accountability? That is a discussion that many people have. We are facing with a case where the responsibility has been mitigated with regard to a higher ranking person, a senior official in the decision-making process, and therefore who has a higher responsibility than this person. And we also received messages, information coming from those prisons, people wishing to confess, to avow what could happen if they come to Europe, because it could only happen in Europe. What are the risks for them? They are facing risk where there are no in Syria or elsewhere, but asking asylum in Europe is a problem. They will arrive in Europe and be judged, of course, prosecuted. I'm not a lawyer, and some lawyers asked that question to judges, and actually it's dealt with on a case by case. It depends on every situation. Confessions, what is the degree of responsibility? We do not have criteria yet for all of that. This discussion should be dealt with, carried over in a Syrian fashion. It should not be demagogical. It should not be populist. It should be really well informed, and the aim should be to rebuild the Syrian society. I'm not talking about a deal that we could imagine with Russia. I'm talking about something else, really. Europe today is the only place where we can hope for a prosecution of those people, while we cannot access the International Criminal Court, the ICC. So, could we have a proper debate promoted? It requires the involvement of politicians, but also of lawyers. I do not have more on this, and would like to let you know that among Syrians in the opposition, we have also that debate. We have officials in the army that defected very quickly, that were executing orders, but who maybe refused executing other orders? Should we make a distinction? Should we make a distinction between the security services throwing people in prison, knowing full well that these will be tortured, and should we make a distinction with the army, which job is to protect a country, not killing people? This is a real question. Some countries do not want to give asylum to these people. What can we do? They say we defected. Yes, they defected, indeed. And we need to find a balanced justice, a reasonable justice, a fair justice. And my worry, I do not want us to block defection. It would be highly regrettable, because these people reveal things that we might never know. Thank you.
Remy wants to come into that, so I will give him the floor. But it's clear that the local criminal code, wherever it might be in the European Union, would apply. So the difficulty is, how could you affect some kind of political policy that would encourage defection, as you say, notwithstanding the criminal code in each jurisdiction. So Remy, you want to comment on that, but also maybe just talk about the impact of the conviction last week in Koblenz on the Syrian diaspora, and as well on the Syrian regime. Do you think it has any effect or impact on the regime itself to see this first ever conviction of somebody from the regime?
Yeah, I think there are very sort of mixed feelings on this subject amongst the Syrian diaspora and Syrians in general. And this is an ongoing discussion, as my colleague just mentioned. These conversations we're in fact having on a daily basis. I mean, of course, what I mean by mixed feelings is that although I welcome, and I'm speaking personally here, I welcome the trial and the conviction that took place last week, at the same time, what we worry about is that the belt has been assigned at a very low level. And I'm saying this with the sense of, if we are to effect transitional justice successfully in Syria, then you can't apply justice on every single level of society and expect that things are not going to go wrong. So usually we would start from the way up down. So it would be Assad, his circle, ministers, heads of security branches, and what we've done, and I think we've been forced into this corner. And I applaud the efforts of Anwar Al Bunni, who has done an amazing job, and his work didn't start here. But I think he's heard this sentiment, and I think that this sentiment has to be represented, where there is worry that, and there are questions, just as Bassma Kodmani brought up Caesar, that Caesar was involved in taking these pictures, and but he was offered protection in the sense that nothing, he was there the whole time these pictures were being taken. He's obviously, the government knows exactly who he is. And this leaves the question of, why would Anwar Islam be held accountable? And why would someone like Caesar not be held accountable? And you could apply that same question to many people. And what I'm saying is not going to sound popular amongst a lot of people, but this is the actual case. This is what we worry about. And I think the only way to sort of bypass this problem, because this problem is here, is that we need real help from EU member states to speed up this process, where we can start raising that belt and actually reaching people who have a much bigger responsibility in all of this. Because for Anwar Islam, some people will argue that this person at the very beginning of the uprising was supporting activists by providing them with documentation that proves to them that they were wanted by the government. So this person very early on was willing to defect. So what I strongly agree with is that we have to be very careful that we do not stop the defection process. In terms of an impact on the trial, the conviction having an impact on Syrians, again, it's had a very mixed impact. Some people just think that this is not where it should start, that we should be aiming much higher than this. And for the regime, I think this is devastating for the regime, because they know that a process has started. And this is the part where I support this process, because once there is a roadmap to taking these criminals to trial, then it just becomes something that we can build on. And I think that's a very positive step. And again, I commend the efforts of Anwar Al Bunni and everyone involved in the trial process.
So I think it would be appropriate to allow Anwar to come back in on that, just to perhaps reply to some of the issues brought up just now by Remy and Bassma. Anwar, would you like the floor for a moment?
Thank you for
You have to unmute, please, Anwar. Your microphone is muted. Thank you. Shukran.
Sorry for that. As Ramy and Mrs. Bassma said, accountability should be a priority, especially when all these crimes were perpetrated, heinous crimes, and these were not perpetrated in secret, but they were perpetrated in front of everybody. And everybody has seen through the videos the different torture that took place against people. And we have seen in videos how the chemical weapon was used, and we have seen direct and live the different bombs which were falling on the hands of citizens and destroying all the civil infrastructure of Syrians, schools and hospitals and so forth. Even if everybody knows about all these crimes and their heinous character, I think that we cannot deal with Syria as we have dealt with other situations, that is not to hold the different criminals accountable or to allow them to be part and parcel of a political solution. This is something that should be clear to everybody. I think that the principle of justice is not a matter of revenge. It's not a matter of penalizing and sanctioning the criminal. It is bigger than that, especially by building the local peace. And this cannot be under this slogan of not holding the criminals accountable or giving pardon to these criminals. Let me remind you now that one of the witnesses in the Koblenz crime, and this is the witness Z30, this person has borne testimony and said that he was coerced to actually dig mass graves, and where he buried many victims. Millions of victims were buried in mass graves in a very uh, in a very bad way. And this testimony should actually shake the conscience of the whole world. These are not 10 people or 20 people who were killed. 1 million of victims were killed and buried in a way that is not human. And they were actually buried under the civil cemetery, so that it would be impossible in the future to discover these mass graves. That and therefore these are crimes that are reiterated, repeated and clear and in public, and they are continuing, and these are so heinous that we cannot consider that the local peace could or could take place through some conciliation and so forth. This type of criminals cannot stop perpetrating these crimes. They cannot be used in order to build a future. We cannot apply the Colombia experience on Syria, not even the Iraqi or Lebanese experience cannot be applied to Syria. This is a Holocaust that is unprecedented in history that took place in Syria in front of everyone, in front of the whole world. And therefore, the fact of if we actually hold these people not accountable, this means that we are somehow sentencing millions of people to the death penalty. If we act like that, we cannot have these criminals part of the future of Syria in Europe. And I am acting in Europe not because I want the criminals to be tried only. We do not want the European justice to be responsible for the situation in Syria, and the European justice cannot actually bear this burden of the transitional justice in Syria. But we need to incriminate these people, and we want to hinder them from being part of our future and the future of our generations. And we have to block any rehabilitation of these people or their reintegration in the international community under any label. And this is the goal of justice that we are aiming at in Europe.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anwar. Nathalie, maybe you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. I have one question here from Katrin Langen-Siepen, who is an MEP, a colleague of ours, who wants to know what the Syrian opposition, how can we support the Syrian opposition from the EU side, which is a question that I will put in due course. But Nathalie, would you like to, do you want to pose any questions at this point?
Merci Barry. J'aurais évidemment énormément de questions.
Well, obviously, I would have many questions because this exchange is extremely interesting. I'd have a question on war criminals in Syria and in Europe and people who committed crimes against humanity. For those who may have gotten a status of refugee. Or I would like to know what our guests think about what happened in Austria, and how would you like us to try to create bridges between European countries, because today Syrian criminals are still able to find their way through Europe. Thank you.
So Bassma, maybe you could pick that up, that question, please.
Je n'ai pas de détails réellement sur cette question.
I don't have details to give on this question. The only thing I can say is that it won't be possible to erase the differences between European countries vis-à-vis Syria. I don't know what the interests or the links or political stakes are at hand here, and as a consequence it's very difficult for me to give an opinion on this. Nevertheless, I'd say it is essential for Europe to realize that European countries all are starting to understand that the Syrian regime is trying to focus on all the tiny differences in between all EU countries, and the regime tries to use the differences of opinion in between European governments, and this is very dangerous because, well, the regime has very strong and very active networks which make the situation much more difficult for us, the democratic opposition, and as a consequence many are able to avoid justice and punishment. And sometimes when there are friendly messages who are in favor of some criminals, well, this goes against all this process in which the whole EU committed itself in order, well, to fight impunity and preserving sanctions against, well, those who deserve them. And it is important to seize justice as soon as it is possible. And if some people do not deserve sanctions, well, then it's up to justice to decide it. That's all I have to say, but my colleagues may have something else to say.
Well, can I just follow up with you, Bassma, again, just one quick question, which is, where does the fight against impunity sit in relation to the Syrian Constitutional Committee? Is it part of? I know there's nothing happening, and it has been very disappointing. But where is it in the context of that? I'll come to Remy in a moment, but just wanted to pick that question up if you don't mind.
Very quickly, I have a very short answer. That question has not been raised up until now, at least not explicitly. And for us, the opposition, we do want to avoid giving any signal that things are negotiable. We avoid, to be very frank with you, we avoid any discussion on that issue because we think that it is a way to bring in the discussions on the constitutions issues that are not under our remit. We are in charge of writing a constitution. It is already very complicated, so we avoid carefully to raise those issues. But granted, the delegation of the regime is always trying to suggest that you want to prosecute, to sanction everyone, and so on and so forth. And we stay very cautious on that for also negotiation tactics reasons, because if I say this is the prison Al-Khatib, these are the responsible, they committed crimes in the negotiations, they will use that as a pretext to stop negotiating. This is not what we discuss about, but in the future we will need to raise those issues as a constitutional principle. We are talking about transition justice as articles in the Constitution, as bodies, authorities in charge of justice, provisional justice, when we will need in the transition period bodies that will have to be created. We say it because we want it to be included in the Constitution then.
Thank you, Bassma, and for that follow-up answer. And just to turn to you, Remy, I just want to ask you a question around journalism and the difficulties that journalists and civil society are having naturally in the gathering of evidence, and also maybe make a comment about new forms of journalism like open source journalism. You know, we've seen what Bellingcat has been able to do, and others. Can you just describe how journalists are contributing to the gathering of evidence? I mean, the international independent impartial mechanism has played a huge role in the Caesar investigation that led to these convictions. But can you just describe that in your experience, Remy? Thank you.
So one of the main pillars, let's say, of the past 10 years and making sure that Syria, that things were accounted for, has been the depending on citizen journalists across all of Syria. We mentioned that over 550 of those journalists have been killed in Syria. It's an unbelievable number. And the reason being that over these past 10 years, it was clear to everyone that documenting what was happening, I'm speaking about citizens in pocket areas of Syria knew that they were the source of information to many of the news networks around the world. And this sort of bolsters that idea you just mentioned of this alternative media that I think that obviously didn't start in Syria, but Syria came in at a phase where this technology was coming in. And a lot of the work that, as you mentioned, Bellingcat, I remember when I was in Aleppo in 2015, towards the end, it was in October 2015, I think, when Russia began its military intervention. Bellingcat was crucial in identifying exactly where, but by using material that was already out there, that the Russian Defense Ministry was putting out there. And it was gathering these pictures and basically proving where Russia was saying it was attacking a location in the city of Raqqa and saying it was attacking ISIS elements, where it was in fact attacking a marketplace in central Aleppo. And just to sort of contrast that, where the Russian Defense Ministry is releasing images of and saying that it's attacking ISIS elements, but it is in fact attacking a marketplace in central Aleppo. And I was fortunate I say, because I was given the ability to actually see this for myself and see exactly how the Russian government also took advantage of the media and tried to play it the other way around. So journalism has been crucial to Syria, but one major blow to Syria, to Syrians, and I think to the international community and anyone who wants to know what's happening in Syria, has been the fact that each party that is involved in this conflict is playing a role in its own form of censorship. So you have Turkey, which was a very crucial country in terms of feeding journalists into Syria, where foreign journalists would go through Turkey. And Syrian journalists that were based in Syria or in Turkey were working cross-border. And I think it's since 2014 that it was almost impossible for journalists to go in and out of Turkey. You would have to be approved somehow by the Turkish government. If you worked for TRT World, then you would obviously have access to Syria. And what this meant was that the narrative on what was going on in Syria was left to the let's say, the Turkish media, Turkish state media, and ISIS's own sort of forms of media, the Russian government, through Russia Today and Sputnik, and obviously the Syrian regime. So what we had from around 2015, let's say beginning of 2015, up until even now, is we have a lot of censorship, where if any journalist just wants to go in to Syria, and they're willing to take that risk of all the risks that there are on reporting in a conflict zone, they're not able to, because there is a bigger risk of trying to get across the border into Syria and whatnot. So I think while journalism has been such an important factor throughout this uprising and many conflicts throughout the region, it is also clear to these governments that journalism can flip the coin. And that's why censorship has been a major obstacle for journalists trying to cover a conflict.
Okay, thank you, Remy. And look, we're just coming to the end. I just want to ask Anwar maybe to very briefly, if you could, Anwar, just describe the next steps in the trial in Koblenz, the other defendant, where that's going, and what you expect to see happen in the next few weeks in the context of that. And then I'll hand over to Nathalie to say a few final words. Thank you.
شكرا.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Andrews, for giving me this last word. I think I need more time as Syrians and as jurists, and we hope from the European Union to support collectively the process of justice which is taking place in the European countries, where it's in Germany or Sweden or Norway, on Austria or Switzerland or Spain or France, within the framework of a global competence. All these countries do have different lawsuits that are engaged on the basis of the international competence. And we hope from the European Union under the Caesar law, as on the basis of Caesar's testimony, who has given some photos of many victims, and also on the basis of the testimony of Z30 in before the German court. And this is something that should lead to having a sort of a law that would penalize and sanction all the criminals from the judicial standpoint. From the political standpoint, the European Union should put an end to this process of losing and wasting time and allowing criminals to kill further people. And this is something that has been taking place in Geneva for a long time. And I think we need to have a transitional justice panel in accordance with 2454, the Security Council resolution, and to start a sort of transitional period in order to make people return. And this is the claim of all the Syrians in the European Union. At the political level, we need to stop giving further time to criminals. And I think that the Geneva process should consider how to put in place a sort of transitional government in order to make Syria get away from this Holocaust and from this nightmare. We hope that the European Union should take a sort of collective stand. We are going to prosecute all the criminals, especially those who have reached Europe, and from all the different organizations. We will be prosecuting criminals from all the criminal organizations who perpetrated crimes in Syria, the PKK and others. And we are now trying to put in place a sort of observatory and traceability center so that we can put in place some files that could be tabled before the competent justice in the countries where they have landed. This is a message to all criminals. Neither Europe, neither any other country could be considered as a heaven for you in order to spend the money that you have gained from your crimes that you perpetrated. I thank you for inviting me and giving me time to talk.
Thank you. And sorry, just one final word for Bassma. Was just Nathalie's question specifically was around the lack of coordination in the EU, which has allowed perpetrators to enter the EU, and any other comment that you wish to make. And then definitely I'll go back to Nathalie. My apologies.
No, I did not have anything additional to say about this point. I want to just point to one thing. The issue of terrorism, which is not very separate in the sense that those have committed crimes. I also want to say, in a very general sense, many Syrians who have now taken refuge in Europe are of major importance to the governments of Europe to trace where these people are, what they have done, and to bring them to justice whenever they are on French or German or European territory anywhere. This is a hidden contribution from key figures from the Syrian revolution. And I think the European Parliament needs to know that. It needs to know that we are fighting terrorism inside Syria, but helping European governments fight terrorism also in Europe. I won't say more, and I'm not sure, Barry, I quite got what you were hoping to hear from me in addition to...
That's perfectly fine, Bassma. I really thank you for responding there. And finally, Nathalie, you might say a few concluding words.
Merci, Barry.
Thank you very much, Barry. Of course, I would like to thank our panelists today, our guests, for their very rich speeches, testimonies. I would like also to thank Shams Al Bunni, who helped us organize this webinar and whose involvement on those issues is very well known. We have heard the horror of the Syrian tragedy. We have also heard the expectations for the European Union. The European Union cannot evade those expectations. We should send several signals. Politically, we should repeat that normalization with the Syrian regime as it is not possible. We should also say that the elections organized by the regime in June have no credibility whatsoever. We should also support the civil society in Syria. We should make sure that it can become free, independent, diversified. We should support the victims of the crimes of the regime in Syria from the European Union. We can also act at the international level. I'm thinking about the next conference of the International Organization for the Fight Against Chemical Weapons. Syria has no place whatsoever in those discussions. It deceived the international community. At the European level, we want to push the European Commission to go further in an action plan for the fight against impunity, and Syria, of course, would be the first target of it. And then what every member state could do. I asked a question on asylum earlier on because we know that there are gaps in our system, and this is no longer possible. Member states should share information together. The list of people that were refused asylum because they are suspected of being criminals of war. We should also make sure that there are prosecutors in the fight against crimes against humanity in each member state. It's not the case today. To make sure that Eurojust has contact points to facilitate the work. We need experts, interpreters being shared, being put in common, so that we do not waste time when we arrest a person. We can move on quickly in the investigation and avoid that person flees. There are very concrete measures to be offered, and the ideas of our guest of a universal competence. We would like every member state to adopt it in a harmonized manner. Of course, legally that is difficult. It is complex. It requires sometimes constitutional changes, even a treaty change. But when the stake is all values, saying it is complicated is not enough. It does not bear any fruits. I would like to give you a last information. At our initiative, the initiative of the Renew Group and of Barry and myself, during the plenary of the European Parliament next week, we will table a resolution at the plenary on the 10th anniversary of the Syrian uprising. Everything you told us tonight will be very useful so that we can defend that resolution, to support you, to make sure that the European Union plays its part, as Bassma Kodmani said, to make sure that justice is respected, but that also right and law prevails in Syria. Thank you to everyone. And Barry, maybe you would like to have a last word.
Definitely a last word, and thank you very much, Nathalie, and thank you very much to our guests. As Nathalie said, their views will be fed into the preparation of the resolution, and we will keep a light on in Europe for the people of Syria for as long as possible. I was delighted to bring the Caesar exhibition to Dublin about 5 years ago, and to see all of that now resulting in convictions is quite heartening and provides hope for the future. So thank you all, to all of you. Thank you to Nathalie for co-hosting, to Shams for all his work, to Claire and Emma in my office who put in a lot of work to prepare for today, and thank all of you for tuning in, and so with that, we'll bring this webinar to an end. Thank you very much.
Merci infiniment. Bonsoir.
Je vous en prie. Bonsoir. Au revoir.
شكرا للجميع. شكرا.